What would you do if the person you thought was family suddenly looked at you differently, standing at your bedside in the dark? I wasn't prepared for what happened next, but now I'm going to tell you everything unvarnished and from the beginning. Listen carefully, because this story will not let you go until the end. In this story, I'm going to tell you about how one quiet night turned my life upside down. Make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and follow me all the way through. It's going to be hot, I promise. I always appreciated the tranquility of my evenings, when the house fell into silence and the world outside the windows seemed distant and unreal. My life flowed at a measured pace, with no sharp turns, and I found solace in the solitude of sitting alone at a table with a book under the soft light of a desk lamp. The night in question, I went to bed earlier than usual, feeling pleasantly tired after a long day. The windows were slightly open, and a light breeze ruffled the curtains as I fell asleep to the hum of the fan in the corner of the room. It started with a quiet sound that jerked me out of my dream. The door creaked open, and at first I thought it was just the old house settling. But then the sound came again, more distinct, like someone treading carefully on the wooden floor, and I tensed instantly. I tried to see something in the darkness, but my eyes weren't used to the gloom yet, and only the ticking of the clock on the wall broke the silence. My heart beat faster when I realized there was someone in the room, and I held my breath, pretending to be asleep so I wouldn't give away my fear. A chill ran down my spine, and I mentally considered my options. Maybe it was the neighbor's cat climbing in through the window, or was I just going crazy with loneliness? But the footsteps came closer, and I could no longer deceive myself. It was a man, and he was standing right next to my bed. I turned slowly, trying not to make any noise, and in the dim light of the moon shining through the curtains I saw the silhouette of my nephew Sasha. He stood motionless, looking down at me, and his face was almost indistinguishable in the semi-darkness, but I recognized his lean figure at once. "Dennis," I whispered, and my voice trembled more than I would have liked, because I didn't understand what he was doing here. He didn't answer, only took a step closer, and I felt the air between us grow heavier, as if something invisible had thickened in the room. "What are you doing here?" I asked louder, trying to sit up, but my body felt like it was petrified with a mixture of surprise and anxiety. Dennis finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "I didn't mean to wake you up, I just couldn't sleep." He faltered, and I noticed his hands nervously clenched into fists and his eyes avoided my gaze. Before I could say anything, he suddenly took a step toward me, and his hand froze in midair, as if he wanted to touch me but changed his mind. I froze, not knowing how to react, and he turned and walked away, leaving only the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it pounding in my ears, my thoughts jumbled by the strangeness of the moment. Why had he come to me in the middle of the night, and what did that awkward pause before he left mean? Sleep came no more, and I stared at the ceiling, feeling the familiar order of my life begin to fray at the seams. This was just the beginning, and I didn't know how deep this story would take me. When I woke up the morning after that strange night, I felt as if I hadn't slept at all, and thoughts of Sasha kept me awake. The sun was barely breaking through the thick curtains, and the house seemed as quiet as ever, but something about the silence felt different now. I lay in bed longer than usual, replaying his nighttime visit, his trembling voice, and the moment he'd almost touched me. Finally forcing myself to get up, I went downstairs, hoping a cup of coffee would help clear my thoughts and give me back a sense of control. The kitchen was cool, and I turned on the coffee maker, trying to focus on the familiar motions to drown out the growing anxiety. When I heard footsteps behind me, my heart jumped again, and I turned around to see Sasha sitting at the table with a mug in his hands. He didn't even look up, staring into the dark liquid in front of him, and his posture was tense, like he was waiting for something inevitable. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice trembled slightly from the memory of the night before. He nodded without taking his eyes off the mug, and the silence between us became almost palpable, as if an invisible wall had grown overnight. I sat across from him, holding my cup, and we sat like that for a few minutes, not saying a word, until the silence began to weigh on me more than I could bear. I wanted to ask what had happened, why he'd come to me at night, but the words were stuck in my throat, and I was afraid I'd upset the delicate balance. His fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of his sleeve, and I saw him furtively glance at me, brief but full of something I couldn't make out. Finally, he spoke first. "I'm sorry about yesterday, I didn't mean to scare you." His voice was quiet, almost guilty, and I felt something inside me clench at that sincerity. "It's okay, it just surprised me," I replied, trying to hide how much it hurt me, but my tone gave away more than I intended. "I had a bad dream, and I just wanted to check that you were okay," he added, but his words sounded uncertain, like he didn't believe them himself. I looked at him more closely, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth, or if there was something more behind it. His eyes, usually so calm, seemed darker now, and something flickered in them that I hadn't noticed before. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me," I offered, feeling the tension between us grow, but he only shook his head and stood up from the table. "It's fine, forget it," he tossed as he walked away, and I was left alone, looking at his empty mug, with the feeling that he had taken more questions than answers away with him. The coffee cooled in my hands, and I sat there, trying to figure out what had changed in him, in us, and why his presence felt so acute now. The day passed in a blur, and I caught myself thinking about that night, about his hand in the air. It wasn't just concern for my nephew, something deeper was stirring inside me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. A few days had passed since that awkward encounter in the kitchen, and I noticed that Dennis had begun to avoid me, hiding in his room. The house that had once seemed like a cozy refuge to me now felt like a place full of hidden tension, and I couldn't get rid of my thoughts about him. Every time I passed its closed door, I felt a strange attraction mixed with anxiety, and the feeling grew every day. I tried to keep myself busy, working, cleaning, reading, but it was all in vain, because his shadow seemed to follow me everywhere. Finally, I decided that I couldn't go on like this, so I knocked on his door in the evening, determined to find out what was going on. When he opened the door, I saw his face pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a long time. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though everything inside was trembling with the anticipation of something important. He nodded silently and stepped back, letting me inside, and I entered, feeling the air in the room grow denser from our shared silence. His room was the same as it always was, books on the table, clothes on the chair, but now it felt foreign, as if I'd crossed an invisible boundary. I sat down on the edge of the chair, and he remained standing at the window, staring out into the darkness, and I realized that it was going to be harder to get started than I'd thought. "What happened that night?" I asked finally, feeling the words come out of me with difficulty, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. He turned to me, and something flashed in his eyes. Fear, confusion, maybe even relief, but he didn't answer right away. "I don't know how to explain," he began quietly, and his voice trembled, as if he was afraid of what he was about to say. I waited, not rushing him, though everything inside me clenched with the desire to understand what he was hiding behind those words. "It wasn't just a dream, I came because I couldn't otherwise," he continued, and his hands clenched nervously as he looked at me. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling my heart beat faster because his tone hinted at something I hadn't expected. He took a step toward me, and suddenly his cold hand grabbed mine, squeezing it so tightly that I involuntarily flinched in surprise. "I can't stop thinking about you, and it scares me," he blurted out, and his voice trailed off and his eyes glittered with emotions he could no longer contain. I froze, not knowing what to say because his words hit me like a wave and I felt the heat of his closeness run through my body. He let go of my hand and stepped back, as if he was afraid of what he'd done, and I sat there, trying to comprehend the moment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he added quickly, averting his gaze, and I could see him struggling with himself, not knowing how to get out of this situation. I stood up, feeling my legs shaking, and said, "I need time to figure this out." As I walked away, I felt his gaze on my back, and that conversation left me with a mixture of fear and a strange excitement that I couldn't explain. After the conversation in Sasha's room, I felt lost, as if the familiar world around me had begun to crumble and I didn't know how to put it back together. We avoided each other for a few days, and the house started to feel too big and empty, even though we were both in it. I tried to keep myself busy, but every time I heard footsteps outside the door or saw his shadow in the hallway, my heart involuntarily clenched. His words that he couldn't stop thinking about me echoed in my head, and I found myself thinking about him more often than I wanted to admit. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of anxiety and something warm that I couldn't name, but it grew every day. I sat in the living room one evening, leafing through my phone to take my mind off my thoughts while the TV hummed quietly in the background, showing some old movie. The light from the streetlights streamed through the window and I watched the shadows of the trees move on the floor, trying to calm my nerves. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, and when I looked up, I saw Sasha standing in the doorway, with his hands in his hoodie pockets and a tense posture. "Can I talk to you?" he asked quietly, and his voice was full of uncertainty, but there was a sense of determination in it that hadn't been there before. I nodded, setting my phone aside and preparing myself for this conversation to turn things upside down again. He stepped closer, stopping by the couch, and I noticed his fingers nervously clutching the fabric of his pockets as he looked somewhere off to the side. "I keep thinking about what I told you," he began, and his voice got a little louder, as if he was forcing himself to speak. I stayed silent, feeling the air between us grow heavier, and waited to see what he would say next, even though a wave of emotion was already rising inside. "It's there for a reason, I can't turn it off, and I need you to know," he continued, and his eyes finally met mine, full of a mixture of fear and hope. I stood up from the couch, not knowing why, but feeling like I needed to be closer, with only a few steps between us. "I don't know what to do about it," I admitted, and my voice shook, because I really didn't understand how to deal with what was happening. He took a step towards me, and suddenly his hand touched mine, lightly, but that touch burned me like an electric current and I froze, unable to look away. "I'm scared too, but I can't pretend," he said quietly, and the next second his face was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. And then he kissed me softly, tentatively, but with such intensity of feeling that I responded involuntarily, and it was as if time had stopped. When he pulled away, I saw the relief and confusion in his eyes, and we just stood there, looking at each other until the silence was deafening. "I'm sorry if that's too much," he whispered, pulling back, but I shook my head, unable to find the words to describe how I felt in that moment. That kiss had left a storm inside me, fear, warmth, wanting to know what it meant, and I knew there was no going back. After that evening in the living room, I felt as if I were in a different world, where everything familiar had become alien and incomprehensible. Dennis began to avoid me even more, and I noticed him hiding in his room, coming out only when I wasn't around. The silence in the house became unbearable, and every creak of the floorboards or the sound of the door closing made me flinch, waiting for him to appear. I tried to go about my normal activities, cooking, watching TV, answering work emails, but thoughts of that kiss never let me go. It was a strange sensation. His lips on mine, the warmth of his breath, and the way my body reacted despite all the doubts I tried to drown out. A week passed, and I realized that I could no longer live in this suspended state where we both pretended that nothing had happened. One evening I was sitting in the living room, just like that time, with a cup of tea in my hands, staring at the dark screen of the TV, which had long since turned off. Footsteps behind me made me turn around, and I saw Sasha standing in the doorway, with the same tense expression on his face as he had then. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice was firmer than before, like he'd finally made up his mind about something important. I nodded, feeling my heart beat faster, and set the cup aside, preparing myself for the possibility that this conversation would determine our future. He came in and sat on the couch across from me with his hands in his lap, and I noticed his fingers trembling slightly, giving away his excitement. "I don't regret what I did," he began, looking me straight in the eye, and his words sounded like a blow I couldn't recover from. I was silent, trying to collect my thoughts, but everything inside me was boiling with a mixture of fear, relief, and something I didn't want to name. "I don't know what it means, but I don't want to pretend it didn't happen," he continued, and his voice became softer, almost pleading. I looked at him, at his tired face, and felt something inside me shift, like I was tired of hiding from the truth too. "I can't forget either," I finally admitted, and my voice sounded hoarse because I was struggling to say the words. He stood up and walked over to me, and before I could say anything, his hand touched mine again, but this time it wasn't by accident. We stood so close that I could feel the warmth of his body, and when he leaned in, I didn't pull away, letting him kiss me again. This kiss was deeper, more confident, and I felt the tension of the last few days dissolve into this moment, leaving just the two of us. When he pulled away, his eyes glistened and he whispered, "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm glad you're there for me." We sat down on the couch, not saying another word, and just sat there, feeling the silence between us become different, not heavy, but warm, like the promise of something new. I didn't know where it would take us, but for the first time in a long time I felt ready to move forward, holding his hand in mine. After that evening, when Sasha and I finally recognized that something had changed between us, I began to notice how the house began to feel alive, despite the silence that still hovered around us. We were no longer avoiding each other, but every glance or casual touch we made in the hallway was full of a new meaning that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. Mornings would start with me making breakfast, and he would come downstairs, sit at the table, and watch in silence as I placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. The conversations were short, but there was a warmth to them that hadn't been there before, and I caught myself smiling when he joked about the weather. It was strange, getting used to him all over again, seeing him not just as a nephew, but as someone closer to me than I'd ever imagined. I was working in my office one afternoon, sorting through papers, when I heard him calling me from the living room, and his voice sounded excited but not anxious. I came down and saw him standing by the window with his phone in his hands, and he turned to me with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Look what I found," he said, showing me a picture of an old park where we used to walk when he was little, and I felt memories come over me in a warm wave. We started talking about the past, about the days when he used to run after me with a stick, pretending to be a knight, and I suddenly realized how much he meant to me even then. The conversation turned to laughter, and I noticed his hand resting on mine as we sat on the couch, and it felt so natural that I didn't bother to remove it. That evening we decided to watch a movie, and I turned on an old detective he'd loved as a kid, hoping it would help us relax. We sat side by side, closer than usual, and I could feel the warmth of his shoulder pressed against mine as the chase scenes flashed on the screen. At one point he turned to me, and I saw something soft, almost vulnerable in his eyes, and he said quietly, "I'm glad we're here, together." I nodded, unable to find the words, and when he leaned closer, I met his movement, letting our lips touch in a brief but tender kiss. It wasn't like before, not a rush of fear or desperation, but a quiet affirmation that we'd both chosen this path. When the movie ended, we were left sitting in the semi-darkness, and I could feel his fingers entwined with mine as silence enveloped us in a soft blanket. "What happens next?" he asked suddenly, and his voice was full of genuine curiosity, not fear like before. I shrugged, looking at him, and replied, "I don't know, but we'll figure it out one step at a time." He smiled, and I realized that for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid of the unknown, because next to him it didn't seem so daunting. That evening was the beginning of something new for me, and I knew that wherever that road led us, we would walk it together. It had been a few weeks since the night Sasha and I had decided not to be afraid of what was going on between us, and I was beginning to notice our lives taking on a new rhythm. Mornings now started with his footsteps on the stairs, and I was used to seeing his sleepy face as he poured himself coffee and I made toast. We talked about little things, about work, about what was on TV, but every time our gazes met, I felt a warmth I couldn't explain in words. Evenings became a time when we sat together in the living room, sometimes in silence, just enjoying the closeness, and I caught myself enjoying this simple routine. But somewhere deep inside me, a shadow of doubt began to grow that I tried to chase away, but it came back again and again. One afternoon I was sitting in my office, checking my mail, when I heard Dennis talking on the phone in the next room, his voice tense, almost angry. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the scraps of phrases "you don't understand, it's none of your business," came to me, and I felt a prick of unease. When he entered the office, his face was somber, and he threw the phone on the desk with such force that I flinched involuntarily. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm even though anxiety was already rising inside, and he nodded, but his eyes avoided my gaze. "Just a friend prying," he answered briefly, and I realized he didn't want to talk about it, but his mood hung in the air like a cloud. We were sitting on the couch that evening, and I noticed him fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt while some show we both didn't really watch played on the screen. I put my hand on his shoulder, hoping it would calm him down, and he smiled slightly, but the smile came out strained, not the same as before. "You can tell me if something's wrong," I said quietly, feeling the distance appear between us again, and he turned to me, looking long and hard. "Sometimes I think we're doing something wrong," he finally admitted, and his words hit me like a cold wind, because I wondered that myself. I squeezed his hand, trying to find the words to reassure us both, but everything inside me clenched with fear that he was right. We sat in silence, and I could feel his fingers trembling in mine as he looked away, as if he were afraid to meet my eyes. "I don't want to lose you," he added quietly, and his voice was full of such pain that I involuntarily pulled myself closer, wrapping my arms around his shoulders. It wasn't like before, not a kiss, just an attempt to keep him close, and he pressed himself against me, resting his face against my shoulder. I stroked his back, feeling the warmth of his body, and I knew the doubt wouldn't go away on its own, but I wasn't ready to let him go. This moment was a test for me, and I knew we'd have to find answers if we were to not lose what we'd built. The doubts Dennis had expressed that night hadn't gone away, but I felt like we were both trying to hold on to what had grown between us, despite all the unanswered questions. Another week passed, and I noticed him looking at me more often with a kind of quiet determination, as if he'd made a decision he hadn't spoken about yet. It was a cold morning, and I was standing at the stove making an omelet when he came downstairs, came up behind me, and put his arms around my waist, resting his cheek against my back. It was unexpected, but the warmth of his hands sliding under my shirt made me freeze, and I felt the tension of the last few days dissolve in that simple gesture. "I'm sorry I was like that," he whispered, and I turned to hug him back, feeling our breaths merge in the morning silence. The day passed quietly, and I offered him a walk, hoping the fresh air would help us both get our minds right, but he shook his head and said he wanted to stay home. That evening we were back in the living room, sitting on the couch, and I turned on some soft music to fill the silence that now seemed too loud. He moved closer, resting his head on my shoulder, and I felt his hand on my chest, slowly sliding down until his fingers lingered at the edge of my t-shirt. I turned toward him and his eyes met mine, full of a mixture of desire and fear, and he asked quietly, "Do you mind?" I shook my head, feeling my heart pounding, and he leaned in, kissing me with such tenderness that I involuntarily pulled him closer. This kiss was deeper than before, and I felt his hands slip under my clothes, gently exploring my skin as I returned the favor, feeling the warmth of his body beneath my palms. We moved slowly, as if afraid to disturb the fragility of the moment, and I noticed his breathing become more frequent as he pressed his whole body against me on the couch. It wasn't just desire, I could feel the need to be closer in his every move, and I let myself dissolve into it, hugging him tighter as the music played quietly in the background. We didn't speak, but words weren't needed. All I wanted to say was in the way I held him, and the way he responded to me, trusting me completely. When we finally pulled away, lying next to each other in the semi-darkness, I stroked his hair and he looked up at me with a smile that seemed so real, I felt at peace. "I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but I feel good with you," he said quietly, and I nodded, realizing that this was our finale, not the end, but the beginning of something we would build together. We fell asleep right there on the couch, under the blanket I had thrown over us, and I knew the doubts would still come back, but now we had something stronger, ourselves. The morning greeted us with sunlight, and I looked at him sleeping next to me, feeling like I was home for the first time in a long time. Would you be able to accept such a change in your relationship with a loved one, or is it too much for you? If I did the right thing, please tell me.